Thank you for being here for this month's genealogy program. Today is February 8th, 2025. I am Jessica Ashton from the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center, and we are here at City Hall as usual. So I just have a couple quick announcements and then I will turn it over to Terri for her program. But just a couple things coming up. On February 27th, we have our community coffee and conversation. And we're especially excited for this one, with it being the month of February where we celebrate Valentine's Day. We thought it would be fun to do our coffee on why we love the museum. And so we invite anybody to come down. It'll be at 9 a.m. at the museum, 612 Royal Gorge Boulevard that morning, February 27th. And if you have any special memories or any stories you want to share about why you love our regional museum, come on down and let us know. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention quick is that we will be out at Senior Mini College. It's the last week of March, and I'll be teaching two different classes. We'll also be there for Resource Day, so keep an eye on the Pueblo Community College schedule. And there's always so many good classes out there, so that's coming up. Just to put that little reminder out there. So, and I will go ahead and pass it over to Terri.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning. I was recently in a meeting, and I mentioned that my topic this month was the Negro Motorist Green Book. And a couple of people had never heard of the Green Book, which surprised me a little bit, but I realized that it's an important topic that is frequently overlooked. And it is something that we don't like to face or acknowledge, that into segregation and prejudice was extremely adhered to in this country for centuries. And so I figured that it was a topic that, while I am probably not qualified to cover, it's a topic that everyone does need to be aware of. It's a slice of our American history that everyone needs to know about and to understand. And while today we still are not perfect, we are trying to make strides for better inclusion. So with that, we'll get started with a little bit of history. We don't think about travel as being really an ancient system. We think of it, especially in terms of leisure, as something that is relatively new, 19th and 20th century. But it's really interesting to realize that travel, and even travel for leisure, has been going on for centuries. The Romans traveled to their Mediterranean villas. They had invented roads. As early as the 2nd century BC, there was the Silk Road, a network of land and sea routes from China to the Middle East and to Europe. And it was for the exchange of silk goods, spices, etc. So, and we don't think about the explorers that set out in the 15th and 16th centuries to explore the world. This was not leisure travel, but they brought back stories of exotic lands, and the carrot was suspended in front of people that they wanted to see more of the world. In the Middle Ages, there were pilgrimages. So this was travel not just for the wealthy, but for the lower classes. People could go to Canterbury, England, or Jerusalem or Rome and make their pilgrimage. At the beginning of the 17th century, something called the Grand Tour And this was indeed travel for leisure. Young aristocrats from well-to-do families, as part of their education, made what is known as the Grand Tour, with Italy being the primary focus. The cities of Rome, Naples, Venice, and Florence, with all their art treasures, their artisans working, were the focus of some of these journeys. Usually the young men were about 21 years old. They had come of age, and they were also accompanied by a tutor or a family member. And these journeys often lasted months or even into years. With the introduction of the railroad in the 1840s in Europe, and not long after that in the United States, touring and travel for leisure became easier. It was interesting to note that there were travel guides even as early as the 1820s. Francis Coughlin, he was I believe he was an Englishman, but he wrote travel guides primarily for France. Oops. This is the Grand Tour map. The prominent red line between England and southern Italy was the normal Grand Tour route. Some of the other routes that we see outlined in green or in the darker red were additional journeys, and Coughlin's volumes did cover the major sites to be seen in each one of these areas. And here are the covers of some of his volumes. He did go on to cover Belgium, Germany, Great Britain, the Netherlands, Russia, and Switzerland. And he advertised that he was showing the cheapest and most expeditious system of traveling. So the mid-19th century marks the start of modern tourism, especially in the United States. There were better roads, there were turnpikes, steamships on either rivers or canals could take people readily from one point to another. The Erie Canal was finished early in the 19th century, and it connected New York and Chicago, major industrial points. Health resorts, spas, and springs with their healing properties also drew a lot of people and leisure tourism. In 1893, Mr. J.W. Buell introduced a travel pictorial guide, America's Wonderlands, a pictorial and descriptive history of our country's scenic marvels as delineated by pen and camera. And the volume does contain some really beautiful photography. Once the car was introduced, traveling became more accessible for everyone. It meant freedom. And here is the introductory cover for Mr. Buell's America's Wonderlands. But it was at the beginning of the 20th century. Our first transcontinental highways were completed. In 1916, the Lincoln Highway, which joined New York City to San Francisco, completely across the country, it connected the entire nation. 1926, Route 20, and in the same year, Route 40, which was known as the Main Street of America. So road travel was becoming popular. But travel was not open to everyone. And it is important to note that it wasn't just African Americans, but every person of color. And even there was discrimination against Jewish people as well. There were separate guides published for Jewish people so that they knew where they could get the food that their diet required. So we're going to talk about a difficult subject, which to some extent does still even exist today. Travel for African Americans was restricted. There were black codes initiated and enacted by states. And the black codes indicated that blacks were not allowed to meet in groups of more than 4. They were not permitted to travel more than 10 miles from their master's residence without his permission. They could not marry Europeans. They could not be tried by juries. They could not buy liquor. So we see how society restricted the blacks. And it did indeed criminalize the mobility of enslaved people. And even free African Americans were subject to these same restrictions. Slaves doing business for their masters were required to carry signed papers. And as we found with the Seamen's Protection Certificates, even free Black persons had to carry these certificates so that they could move around. In Charleston, South Carolina, for example, they issued metal badges to be worn by the slaves around their neck. And this permitted the slave to work away from their official residence. If they had a particular talent, if they were able to make cabinets, for example, they might be allowed to go into the city to sell their wares. It's important to realize, though, that the money went to the master. Blacks did find ways to travel clandestinely. They did secretly meet with family members. They could go short distances, here again, undercover and totally in secret. After emancipation, they did have more choices. It definitely was not a free and easy existence. But after emancipation, the movement called the Great Migration, where African Americans moved north and west, did begin. This is one of the slave badges that might have been worn. It does indicate that it was in Charleston. This one happens to be from 1852. There is a number, 247, on it, and it indicates that the person was a mechanic. So that was the occupation that he was allowed to perform when he was away from his master. Here is another one from 1860, and this slave was a fruiterer, probably selling fruits in the Charleston market. One of the biggest draws for a lot of people traveling was to visit family if they lived in a different place. Didn't have to be a far place. It could have been a relatively near place. But visiting family was a reason, and traveling home to the home place. African Americans, when they took the train, were allowed to sit in the Negro car. And it was usually the car that was directly behind the engine. And you have to realize that soot from the coal burning poured into the passenger compartment. So that's why this was the relegated car for African Americans. If there was a dining car, there was a separate dining car for the Negro passengers. We also are very, very familiar that African Americans had to sit in the back of the bus. And it was automobile ownership that finally gave some freedom for travel to African Americans. But discrimination continued. Jim Crow laws were in place for many, many years. And there was always the threat of violence. One of the authors that I read indicated that accommodations were hard in large cities, a gigantic task in small towns, and sheer luck in anything smaller. And we don't realize that not only was it a place to stay that presented a quandary, but where were you able to buy gasoline to power your car? Where could you eat? What restaurants were open and available to seat African Americans? Even restrooms. Could an African American use a restroom? And when traveling, you might encounter other obstacles that were not free and available to African American travelers. There were something called sundown towns. These were all white communities where Black people were allowed to work and shop during the day, but by nightfall, they had to make sure that they were not in that community. They could be escorted out of town by law enforcement or, heaven forbid, angry mobs. They could face arrest, violence, or any form of punishment for breaking the rules of these towns. These towns were found in almost every state up until about the 1950s. So it was a dire set of circumstances. One of the first automobile guides was the Automobile Green Book. This was not just for African Americans. This was for everyone. And it was an early version of what we consider the AAA tour guides of today. And even those are going by the wayside. They were published between the 1920s and into the 1950s. And they gave turn-by-turn directions for trips between major cities. And these are really interesting to look at. Here is the cover. They were put out by the Automobile Legal Association, the ALA. And here's one for 1922 in the Midwest. And we see the various sections. They had the country divided into sections, and they gave specific directions from one place to the next, including mileage markers. Here, for example, we see Chicago to South Bend, Indiana, for a total of 102 miles. And it's by way of two interim cities. And you can see where you leave Chicago at a particular junction, and at 2.9 miles, you turn left onto 33rd Street. And you go all the way the 52.5 miles to the Valparaiso Courthouse at Main and Washington Streets. Then you continue with the next leg of the journey. Must have taken many pages to write these books. So one of the first guides that acknowledged African-American need for travel was Billboard magazine, the same magazine that exists today for musicians and music aficionados. Because entertainers and musicians were travelers, they established an actual mail service. And in 1920, they hired a Black journalist named James Albert Jackson to write a weekly column for Black performers. And it was actually published as Jackson's Page. And we're going to hear a lot more about Albert or James Jackson. The magazine was founded in 1894, and it did cover the whole of the entertainment industry. And we're talking not only about musicians, but vaudeville, circuses, fairs, burlesque shows. But they focused more on music when the jukebox and the phonograph and radio became popular. But Mr. Jackson recognized the importance, actually the magazine recognized importance of entertainment in the African-American economic market. So he was named the editor of the Negro department for the magazine. He compiled a list of stopping places that were available for the Negro traveler. And by 1934, he was the first African-American to work for Esso Standard Oil Company. And we're going to see James Jackson a couple of more times before we finish this presentation. Here's a picture of him. And the guide that he produced had a listing of about 600 establishments nationwide. The information was provided by the musicians themselves. They would come back to a central location, and they would report back to the magazine about what they encountered in their travels. In reality, no more than 100 of the 600 establishments were bona fide hotels that would accommodate colored travelers. So in 1930, Hackley and Harrison's Hotel and Apartment Guide for Colored Travelers was produced. It was a collaboration between Edwin Hackley and Sadie Harrison. Edward Hackley, he was born in Michigan in 1859, and interestingly enough, in 1883, he was the first African-American lawyer admitted to the Colorado Bar Association. Beginning in 1886, he worked as the Denver County Clerk, and he eventually worked as a newspaper man, and he actually wrote a play. The guide that they produced listed room, board, and garage accommodations. And they managed to list about 300 cities in the US and Canada. Unfortunately, 1930, we're at the very, very start of the Depression. And so that the popularity of the guide was extremely short-lived. The travel market dried up overnight. But here is a cover of their guide. And we'll see that many of these publications that we'll talk about today did rely on the correspondence and the input of travelers. Subscribers paid $1 for a one-line entry. So if you wanted to advertise your rooming house, your hotel, your garage, your facility, beauty shops and barber shops were very popular as well. The guide was sold wherever they could find agents, newsstands, bookstores, and hotels. And they had planned to revise and augment these annually, but the 1930 edition was the one and only. This is from that 1930 edition in Indianapolis, Indiana. We have the Parkview Hotel. And interestingly enough, there is the Parkview Hotel in 1975. And it indicates that from 1929 to 32, their address was the home of the Parkview Hotel. Though it did not last long in this location, the hotel was a point of pride in the community. Its grand opening, detailed in the October 29th, 1929 issue of the Indianapolis Recorder, reported that there were a 30-piece band playing to celebrate the event, with hundreds of people touring the renovated building. And you'll note the date was October 29th, 1929, mere days after the stock market crash. And we see from the 1930 census the Parkview Hotel. And we see that Anna Thornton is a maid. Ruby Palmer is a housekeeper. James Scott, Carol Blair, and DeWitt McRunas are waiters. James Irwin is a lawyer. And Willis Rolland is a salesman. So the hotel was in operation with staff, but only a couple of visitors as of the census day. We also see from city directories that Lawrence Perry was a porter at the Parkview Hotel. We also see in Columbus, Mississippi, the Queen City Hotel. And here is a picture of that hotel. And this was an area of center of African-American life and entertainment in Columbus, Mississippi. The building was built by Robert Walker in 1914, and it hosted Major League Baseball players, musicians that played in the local area. And we see just a single line entry in the 1920 census where Mr. Robert Walker is recorded as the owner of the hotel. From city directories, we see that a dentist, George W. Washington, rooms at the Queen City Hotel. So as the country became more mobile, the need for recognized safe places for African Americans to stay, the need did still exist. And in 1933, Alfred Edgar Smith called for, quote, the compilation of an authentic list of hotels, rooming houses, private homes catering to the occasional traveler, tourist camps, and every type of lodging whatsoever, including those by members of other races and open to Negroes. Smith was an administrative assistant and a staff advisor in the WPA, and along with a bevy of famous and extremely well-regarded African Americans, he was a member of Roosevelt's Federal Council on African American Affairs. And under his watch, the National Park issued a directory of Negro hotels and guest houses, and the Department of the Interior also published a directory. The Conoco Travel Bureau also recognized the market for African American travelers and the business that they might generate. So Mr. Luck was an early executive, and in 1933, Conoco started a free travel service. And just like with the AAA, you would receive customized maps, information about attractions, and how the routes were laid out from one place to another. It featured supposedly a complete list of Negro hotels, tourist homes, YMCAs, and YWCAs. But there is no record that the publication actually ever existed. And we come to the Negro Motorist Green Book. It was founded by a gentleman named Victor Hugo Green and published for 30 years between 1936 and 1966. Because he was a resident of New York, the first edition did focus on New York City. But over the years, it expanded to cover much of North America, and he even expanded well beyond that. It became, quote, the Bible of Black travel during Jim Crow. The publication actually ceased after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, but there are, I believe there are two other editions that were published by a different company after the Civil Rights Act. Excuse me. Mr. Green was a resident of Harlem, New York, but he was a mail carrier in Hackensack, New Jersey. He had traveled, he had been in World War I and had traveled overseas, so he was no stranger to travel. He knew the locations of businesses along his mail route, and he recognized that his fellow mailmen knew about the businesses along their routes as well. He married Alma Duke of Richmond, Virginia, and she liked to visit her family. She was very knowledgeable of the Richmond area, and she routinely, on a pretty annual basis, visited them. So he had the connection in New York, New Jersey, and she had the connections in Virginia. They went into business with his brother, William. He was a partner for 8 years. And Robert Duke was a relative of Alma's, and he was a musician. So he too traveled, and he was able to provide a wealth of information about traveling, the accommodations, and what was available out in the nation for African Americans. Alma took over publishing when Victor retired in 1952. And here's a picture of Victor. And what he did was he enlisted all of his mail carriers to find advertisers. And during the course of the lifetime of the guide, over 10,000 businesses were featured in the guides. These are African American businesses and businesses that served the African American population. As I mentioned with the earlier guide, correspondents provided reviews. They were invited to provide confirmation that places were safe and comfortable to stay in. And they also accepted criticism as well. They wanted their guides to be faithful and reliable. They were distributed by mail order and by word of mouth. And the specific aim was safety. We don't think about safety so much when we travel, but this was a prime concern for African Americans. I find this a little sad. In the introduction for the first 1937 volume, Green wrote, quote, "There will be a day sometime in the near future when this guide will not have to be published. That is when we as a race will have equal rights and privileges in the United States. It will be a great day for us to suspend this publication, for then we can go wherever we please and without embarrassment. But until that time comes, we shall continue to publish this information for your convenience each year." This was written in 1937. Unfortunately, Victor Green died in 1960 before the Civil Rights Act was passed. In 1949, they did create a travel agency, and they expanded to listings in Mexico and Bermuda. And they actually changed the name from the Negro Motorist to the Negro Traveler's Green Book. As I said, Victor passed away in 1960, and Alma published the last edition in 1962. Two further editions were published by Langley Waller and Marvin Tapley in the 60s. Here's a picture of Alma. And you remember James Billboard Jackson, and he was an executive at the Esso gas stations. Well, he paired up with Hugo, and the Esso gas stations became major distributors of the Green Book. They were available for purchase, and they cost about 25 cents. Esso gas stations did welcome black travelers, and they did establish franchises for Black businessmen. They also encouraged employment of Black employees. And we see the original version, or one of the original versions. This is a 1940 edition, and it's still the Negro Motorist. excuse me, and from the introduction, we see that they are trying to compile facts and information to use and depend upon. They're asking users to contribute their ideas, suggestions, and information. And if they are dissatisfied with any of the accommodations, to let them know so that they can revise their additions. We see the list of states that this 1940 volume covered, and it's not all 50 of the states. But we see, for example, a listing in Wilmington, Delaware, of a tourist home for Mrs. E.W. America. And we find her in the 1930 census, prior to the Green Book, living at that address. Her husband is a janitor, and she is a housewife, and their niece is living with them. 10 years later, in 1940, we see that her husband is not working. She is listed as a housewife. Her niece is still living with her. Excuse me. Yeah, we see Marion Gibbs, and we see William Robinson, and they are listed as lodgers. In 1941, in Colorado Springs, we see Mrs. G. Roberts listed in the Green Book. And here in 1930, her husband George is a hotel doorman. She has rooms available. Her son Maurice is a department store porter. Gilbert Morris is living in the household. He's a construction laborer. And Raymond Spann is a general man in an auto repair shop. And Mr. So we see that these are lodging houses, but they were open and available for African American travelers. And here we see Mr. James Howard, who is a restaurant bartender living at the Roberts home. In 1962, we have the A.G. Gaston Motel, which is a famous African-American establishment. Mr. Gaston was a businessman in Birmingham, Alabama, and he built the motel in 1954. It served as premium accommodations for African-American travelers, and Room 30 was famous as the headquarters for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference during the Civil Rights Movement. And here is a picture of Martin Luther King at the A.G. Gaston Motel. As times changed, the volume also changed with the times. After World War II, Black servicemen were returning home, and many of them wanted to further their education, and education did become available. So in their 1947 issue, they listed Black schools and colleges that were willing to accept World War II veterans. In 1951, they published a special edition that focused on train travel and the emphasis on Pullman cars. Pullman cars had been around for a long time, and the men who worked on Pullman cars, Mr. Pullman insisted that they be African Americans from the very start. In 1953, air travel became a subject, and they wanted to demystify the idea of international travel. So they included information in the 1953 edition. And by 1961, they had become politically active in the desegregation movement, and they supported it. Here we have a 1956 new name, the New Negro Travelers Green Book. Excuse me. And while Victor is listed as the editor and publisher, we are seeing a couple of women now working on the board. And he did, especially with Alma in later years in the 1960s, we do see the more influence more of women in contributing and having the editorial and director positions. The travel service for international cruises. We see advertisements within the United States with pictures of some of the owners or managers of the properties. And we see newspaper accounts. The Green Guide was suspended during World War II. There was not a need for travel at this particular time, and many African Americans were actually serving in the military services. So they suspended for 4 years publication of the guide. And this article is about the resumption of the publication. On their 25th anniversary, another article appeared in the newspaper speaking about the brief history of the guides. But the Green Book was not the only guide for African American travelers. There were several others. Smith's Tourist Guide of Necessary Information for Businessmen, Tourist, Traveler, and Vacationist. It was just a one-year publication in 1940. Gray's Travel and Business Guide also was published in 1936, and it was updated twice. And it's specifically directed at businessmen. And for the first time, it included nightclubs, so where African Americans could go for entertainment. The cover of Smith's Tourist Guide. And we see Mr. Jackson again. And he is an Esso gas station or Esso manager at this point. It is probably the ranking position held by a Negro in the general business world. He's an Esso marketer. And when we talk about safety and the concerns that African Americans had in travel. When driving a car, any of us can be pulled aside, but African Americans were targeted, not just in the South, but as well in the North. So these guides also included information about speed laws. What were the actual speeds in different conditions within a town? The use of hand signals in your car, how to navigate school buses. What were other rules of the road? Border restrictions, how to report an accident, things that we don't today necessarily think about, but were extremely important at the time. Here we see a map of the New Orleans area and additional information about other rules of the road, restrictions, non-resident service of process law. So another guide that was briefly published was the Go Guide to Pleasant Motoring. It was marketed to Black elite, and it was a pocket-sized guide, and it gradually increased to a full-sized periodical. It included photographs of managers or owners of establishments like we have seen. And here we see an advertisement for the Hotel Deluxe in Raleigh, North Carolina. We see Canyon City motels listed in the Go Guide. We see the Court Daisy and the El Canyon Lodge. And here is a postcard of the Court Daisy, which still exists today, diagonally across from City Hall here. And we see in the 1950 census that Forrest Nicholson is the owner of that hotel. He and his wife purchased the hotel in 1950 and owned it until 1954. It's interesting to note that they are white, but that they are willing to accept African American tourists. Here's a picture from the museum taken in 1948 of the El Canyon Lodge, which no longer exists here in town. It opened in 1947 with 11 cottages, ranged from 1 to 4 bedrooms. They had showers, tubs, and kitchenettes, Coronado furniture, and blankets with El Canyon woven into it. Excuse me. In a later edition, in addition to the 2 motels, we also have the Knotty Pine and the Triangle Auto Court. And here is the Knotty Pine on Highway 50 and what we know today in the area. The travel guide was another that was in competition with the Green Book. It was founded by a traveling musician, William Butler, and it focused on the upwardly mobile Black community. And here we see a 1952 cover with our young woman featuring her golf clubs. And as mentioned before, we see listings not only for hotels, rooming houses, but we see doctors, lawyers, Waymeyer's clothing store here in Colorado Springs. So all of those businesses that are willing, excuse me, to serve the African American community. Here is a leather cover from Waymeyer's and a picture from 1947 of the actual store. Today, only about 5% of the Green Book sites are still in operation. More than 75% of them are gone. The National Park Service does have a listing of Green Book properties, and they actually have pictures as well as brief histories of each of the locations that are on the National Register of Historic Places. Here is one in Denver, the Rossonian Hotel. And finding the information, the National Park Service, the Department of Interior Directory, the New York Public Library has a lot of these library guides, and they do have actual editions of the Green Book Go travel guide that you can page through and see. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, and the Smithsonian Museums also have a good bit of information about African American travel and the various guides that were published. In terms of books, the Gretchen Soren book, Driving While Black, is very, very good resource for information. And newly published Overground Railroad, The Roots of Black Travel in America, is an excellent book. There are a couple of websites that you can actually visit to see pictures, interviews, various aspects of the Negro travel experience. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, and there is an actual movie on the Smithsonian website, The Green Book Guide to Freedom. In concluding, I want to give a quote. By giving individuals the opportunity to choose to patronize businesses that would treat African American customers with respect and dignity, the Green Book gave agency to its readers. Similarly, it allowed business owners to target an interested client base. It enabled travelers and businesses to harness unified economic power to push back against oppression and harassment. That Victor Green chose to include businesses such as golf courses, country clubs, state and national parks, and other recreational pursuits also celebrated activities beyond just basic survival. It tried to elevate the traveling experience from survival to enjoyment and eventually to social action. So, in thinking, did one of your relatives own a property that welcomed African American travelers? Did they own a business like a gas station or a restaurant that might have been listed in the Green Book? Did they work at a business? Did they travel or stay at one of these historic locations? So with that, I will turn it back to Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you, Terri. Thanks for putting that together. It was just really a really great way for us to kind of honor Black History Month and to kind of keep that in our minds as we, celebrate African American history through the remainder of this month. It's nice to know that there's businesses here in town, in support and listed there in the Green Book. One of the things that really jumped out at me was the introduction you shared that where they acknowledge what a great day it'll be when they can cancel the publication. But then, it really puts it into perspective when you think it was another 30 years before they really got any traction with that.
Yeah.
Um, All right. Well, thank you for being here as always. We hope to see you next month for Harvey Houses. It'll be Saturday, March 8th at 9 a.m. And again, if you want to come down to our community coffee, tell us what you love about our museum. That's going to be February 27th. That's also 9 a.m. It's in person at the museum, and we'll have coffee and donuts.